I actually started writing poetry seriously in university, in my undergrad, and I was doing a poetry writing class in my university, and about when the class was over, after that semester ended, I discovered poetry slams, and that introduced me to a whole new world of presenting poetry, of sharing poetry, and I think that really influenced the way I write, in that I feel I don't take myself as seriously when I write poetry nowadays, and it's sort of given me a chance to be more playful and sort of be funnier, make sure my poetry is accessible to people, and it's something that I would like to hear.
Actually, my experience is quite different because I didn't start off with page poetry. Most of it has been spoken word. I think that was sort of my entry to poetry in general. Before that, it was just like a general interest in literature and enjoying reading. But I think for me, one thing that, when I did start writing poetry, a lot of times some will say like, oh, that's superfluous, or like you could do without that line. But I think when they heard it in my voice, then they're like, oh, that makes sense. I think that's what spoken word poetry does, where you could give that exact same spoken word poem to someone and then give it to someone else, and the effect can be completely different based on how they perform it.
In a sense, you can have more freedom to just be yourself and say things that you would want to say.
And I think that when I write a piece, I want to remind the audience who that person is, in a way. So when I wrote a poem, it was called From Flooded Chennai to Singapore, A Letter of Forgiveness, and it was basically me being in a flooded hotel room and not being able to contact a person, and then sort of having this realization that this whole situation is so much bigger than me, than my petty first world problems, in a way. So it kind of goes, so darling, forgive me that your last message was unseen, some message caught in between lines of electricity. Forgive me, thoughts of you can be comfort in a second and murder the next. So I think the sort of repetition on page, you would be like, it's very clear that there's a forgive me in it. There's no need to sort of repeat yourself. But I think when you say it out loud for emphasis, it sort of creates a rhythm, and there's sort of, I think with each forgive me, there's a different varying level of desperation as well. So I think that's something you can play with when you say it out loud versus if it's just on page.
Yeah, that's a great point. For me, as I was mentioning, I think I really found a way to sort of like let myself be funny and play with the words more when I was doing spoken word. And one example is this poem that I actually co-wrote with my group, the Scallywags. It's called The Cat Feeding Vigilantes, and it's inspired by the fact that I realized the word vigilante sounds like vigil and auntie. So I have a line which kind of goes, the cat feeding vigilantes, they're coming to your town council. But if it's on the page, it will just sound like the cat feeding vigilantes, they're coming to your town council, which is less funny.
And I think if it's on page, it takes a lot on the reader to sort of make that effort and be like, oh, what's happening here? I need to unpack this. Versus I think with spoken word poetry, you kind of unpack that for the audience.
For me, I think one thing is, I'd say sort of like experimentation and playfulness in a sense. Because I think for lots of spoken word poets, actually me as well, I think we sort of come into it by watching people. Performance arts, it's the kind of thing where you have to train and you sort of learn from other people before you become creative. And I think spoken word, a lot of people understand that there is sort of a formula to having a good, so-called good, popular, a very relatable spoken word poem. So much so that we sometimes forget that we can be more experimental, that we can play with the form.
I agree with you actually. I think for me, in a similar vein, I think that sometimes we watch so much of spoken word poetry, especially if you're you watch things on like Button Poetry, for example, which is a YouTube channel. And even if whether you are interested in spoken poetry or not, that's something you probably would have seen like a couple of videos on Facebook or something of that sort. And I think that what happens is that you see so many of these videos and you sort of can pick out on like, the sort of language that they use. I think the topics tend to be the same. And I think it's very easy to kind of get yourself started. But I think that when we do perform spoken word poetry, we need to think about, what exactly is your voice? So if you're just following a certain spoken word poet that you really, really like, or a certain way of speaking, I think you're kind of doing yourself injustice because you don't allow your own authentic voice to come out. So I think making more different choices on the topics that you write about, and also the way you present yourself. And when it comes to rhythm, the type of tonality, I think we can really kind of break that tonality that everyone kind of sees on YouTube. I think that would be like the first step to being more experimental.